Hey, grade 5. Today we're just going to do a quick little lesson on countries, corruption, and development. I'll look around the world. So, here's a little map of the Human Development Index. It doesn't necessarily show the whole story, but it shows us quite a bit. So the darker blue countries are countries that are considered more developed. And if you went to some of these countries, you would certainly find things that we expect here, like in places like Australia and New Zealand. You would expect to find running water and electricity and things, and buses that arrive on time, and things that work properly, and generally a higher standard of living. And that's kind of the idea of human development. There's a lot of development. There's good roads, there's good railways, there's good airports, and just generally everything's kind of set up well. A lot of these countries are, you can see, like European, in essence, right? Europe is very developed, and then Canada and the United States, and then Australia and New Zealand are all like some of these majorly developed countries. Then you see Japan and South Korea. They both westernized quite early on and became very industrial, especially Japan, with Japan even being able to go toe-to-toe in like military fighting during World War II with Western countries. So Japan showed itself to be formidable when it developed, and Japan is very, very developed with a lot of people living in quite a small space. So another thing you'll see in developed countries is bigger cities. This doesn't mean that just having bigger cities makes everything good. There's lots of bad things, and there's lots of countries that are less developed that have big cities. The next ones you see are high development. You'll see Eastern Europe has a lot of this high development. So they were mostly under communist rule. So there were lots of barriers to development, but the state did build up some infrastructure, and they did have some things that were done at least well, and they've actually managed to somewhat move towards becoming more and more industrialized over the last 20 years. Some countries like Russia, of course, they've struggled quite a bit, but they've, because of their massive amounts of resources, they've been able to pull forward. And just because they have a lower development doesn't mean they're a weaker country per se. Some of these countries are very powerful, as Russia is, with a big army and nuclear weapons. And so it doesn't mean that they're necessarily weaker or less able. They just might have less on an average, a person living in Russia is going to live a lower standard of living than someone in Canada. On average, there are very rich people, and that's something that we will get into soon, that oftentimes in these countries, the wealth is distributed as just with normally a few people, and there's a lot of corruption, and that creates problems. But you see there's also Argentina, and then the one kind of outlier that you'd think is very weird is this one in the Middle East, which is Saudi Arabia. And hopefully you'll be able to see that. It's kind of just by itself there, sort of in the middle. That country is very rich because it has a lot of gas, so they've managed to really invest a lot. Yes, and then you see Africa generally has the lowest standard of living. Some of those countries, like South Africa, and then even Zimbabwe's in there, you wouldn't be able to see it, but some of these countries have been developed more in the past and have struggled and fallen backwards because of internal issues, and there's lots of that happens in Africa for a variety of reasons, which we might not have time to cover entirely. And there's other places in the world that are also struggling because of lots of conflict. One thing we know is that the Lord gave us a ton of stuff. So every nation, every peoples, everywhere in the world you go, basically, there are, there's a bounty of creation. God gave us these great resources. So from Vietnam, where you see this picture of those kind of farms that are on like terraced farms, there's lots of good food that can be produced there. Even, the oil that we find on Earth and the metals and everything can be put to great use to build giant bridges or spaceships or get food on your table, right? All of this is our gifts from our Father, who gives to everyone, regardless of whether they're Christian or not. The Bible talks about how the Lord rains down rain on the wicked and the righteous, right? So it is God just gives. This is sometimes called common grace, in a sense that God not grace as in it saves you, but as in God gives to everyone great things, which allow us to do really cool things. But then on the other side of things, there is corruption and collapse. So while God gives us many good things, we, on the other hand, often misuse things. So whenever we look around the world, we're going to see signs of the fall, either overtly or a bit more hidden. So you'll see people not doing things that they should, not loving their neighbors, being greedy and selfish. And so this is all about, humans are sinful, and the creation is also under a curse. So not everything always works out as well as we'd like. And you see right, there can be natural disasters that set countries back or can leave like lots of devastation. As you can imagine, like Krakatoa, when it exploded, right, that caused devastation to the local areas, and it takes quite a while to recover. And if you're already not doing well, then it can be even harder to recover. So when devastation hits Japan has a lot of money and resources, at least a lot of capability to mobilize its people and its resources to fix the problem and rebuild and rescue people. In other countries where they're poor and there's devastation, they just don't have the infrastructure to actually help people. If you live in the States, in southern states, the big thing is you need to leave the area of the hurricane. But to leave, you need vehicles and good roads. And so if you're in a country where you don't have good roads, that means that first off, you can't leave the area that's in trouble first. You might not even have warning that there's trouble coming, which in Canada and the States, you'll get warning. There you won't get any warning. And so there's problems, right? And then, so I have some of these pictures, right? Like there's guys waiting for the train station and the trains are all pretty much destroyed, right? So that shows that some countries, right, South Africa particularly is a great example of this, where they have all these things and systems that were built up, but over time they haven't been looked after. And so a lot of them are using trains that are very old and have just kind of fallen into disrepair. And so you have this picture of this guy waiting for a train, but each train is dead, basically. One is still on fire. And you have these kids, right? So obviously you guys can come to school and feel safe, but there's a lot of kids that don't feel safe around the world, and a lot of people who don't feel safe. And so, the question that we think of, what do you want to be when you grow up? We often answer as like a firefighter or something like that. Some people just want to be alive. And then, we could see more corruption in the top one. But so this is a big factor in how countries work, is that the human sin often creates corruption, and people start taking from the side, and then systems start to fall apart. So there's this word called developing countries, and it used to be called the third world, but that's an old term. And now there's a new one called the global south, but these are all kind of complicated, but we'll just stick with developing countries. So these are countries that are still developing and on the process of getting better. So this mostly happens through industrialization, which is like building factories and building the ability to make more stuff. So traditionally people would make things all by hand, and the process would be very slow. But once you start industrializing, you can start making things more rapidly and produce more stuff, which makes you more money. You get all the infrastructure in place, railways and these kinds of things allow you to become rich. Now, a developing country can be a very loose term, because a lot of countries could be considered developing. And the idea that there are developed countries versus developing countries can be kind of a bit of a weird term, because it's not like any country wants to just stop doing, like, innovating and developing. But generally the idea is that if you get to a Western standard of living, you're kind of at a developed stage. And so a lot of countries are working towards that, but have not exactly reached it. Now, this carries with it an idea that everything is always getting better, which is not always true. If we think about the Roman Empire, right, there was a great deal of development, and then things happened, internal problems, barbarians from the outside, and it collapsed. And there was a sort of dark ages that came afterwards, where things got worse. People weren't bathing as much, weren't able to have the same infrastructure, roads weren't being created as well, and a lot of the administration went way down. And this happened more recently, of course, We think of you can think of countries like South Africa, or in Russia. Russia had a big problem where it was it was kind of stealing from other people and stopped being able to do that, and then had issues and went down, and then it's kind of coming up. And then you have other countries like Venezuela that spent their money really badly, and they went from being a fairly rich country to being very poor rather quickly. Same can be said about Argentina, where they spent too much money and then they had trouble. And Zimbabwe, all these countries, a lot of times they stop managing their stuff very well, and then they collapse. And the collapse can be quite devastating, right? To go from a nice standard of living to a abysmal one can leave people frustrated and can actually create further problems, because then people are angry and then they fight and bitter about what's left, or fight about what is left. And then we see the sin just kind of keep tearing down. And even in countries that are doing well, there can be underlying issues that might not show at first, right? The Roman Empire looked probably pretty solid for a long time, and then it all of a sudden started really having problems. Same with the Roman Republic, right? The Roman Republic, when it became an empire, had a lot of corruption in it. Even though it was still very powerful and still conquering stuff, there were a lot of issues, and that led to an internal strife. We also learned about, under Constantine, there was those battles, right? So these things are created by problems inside the country, where things break down and there's competing interests, and it can create a big issue. And all normally because of sin. And we can think of James in James's letter, how he talks about what causes us to fight, and it's often our desire for other people's stuff. We're coveting what other people have, which is a sin, and we can see that. This is actually a picture of Bosnia, and there was a big war, right? So I went there and played rugby. This isn't my picture, but I saw buildings that had big, half there because they got hit by a tank or bombed by something, right? So when a war happens, it can often leave a country pretty badly off. That's that. And then there's this final thing, rogue states. Rogue states are countries that don't really cooperate much with other countries. And so, there's a few of them. The most well-known one is North Korea, rather, which often is belligerent and doesn't engage or play well with other countries. And these are called rogue states. Anyways, guys, hope you enjoyed. Bye.